Hey, good evening and good afternoon and good morning in some places. Welcome to June 19th. This is Juneteenth, a holiday that celebrates African American culture. I am E.D. Mondaine, and I want to have a conversation with you today about the importance of soul food in our lives and what a part it played in the African American culture in the 1800s. This is the politics of soul food. I grew up in a family where excellent cooks surrounded me. One of the highlights of my childhood was anticipating my mother's fabulous evening meals. Considering how little there was in the cupboards and the fridge, the meals that she prepared seemed to appear out of nowhere. In addition to candied yams and fried corn, collard greens, and pork chops, the menu included pig ears, pig feet, and pigtails. Now, chitlins or chitterlings, or as they have known to many of us, are another item that I forgot to mention. Most African American kitchens serve this mouth-watering dish during holidays. And it has been a celebrated delicacy over many years. Throughout the United States and abroad, chitlins have been highlighted in various competitions and festivals. Now, it will delight your soul if you've never tried it. And most people are shocked when they discover what chitlins are. Chitlins are actually pig intestines. Now, cooking chitlins produces a foul smell, especially when cleaning them. And although made from pig intestines, it's still a viable food source. And it was a viable food source for African Americans, especially slaves. But it must be carefully and thoroughly cleaned before it could be consumed. As a part of the West African culture, sharp and peppery spices masked the innards and protected us against bacteria. And in addition to being African American legacy dishes, their ingredients and preparation and festiveness contributed to the survival of mostly impoverished households. The chitlin is a delicacy, but it also illustrates the innate creative abilities of African Americans and their inherent survival abilities. African Americans needed to use traditional herbs and sauces to cover up the unpleasant smell and taste of the master's barns and storehouse leftovers. We could only eat the leftovers that he didn't want, so we had to make good out of what we could get. This brings me to this point. As a metaphor, this perfectly describes where African American society has been and continues to be even today. Since the master butchered and kept the best parts of the cow, the pig, or whatever for himself, African Americans had to make do with leftover scraps. The period following the Civil War, known as the Reconstruction, is the best example I know of how African Americans, have settled for the tripe of social and political power. The history here is surprisingly little known and should shock us all. The events of that time were much more volatile than most Americans recognize or even want to comprehend right now today. Listen, there was a new South emerging from the old South. Southern economies were devastated by the Civil War. The burning of cotton fields and the destruction of the cotton gins, aside that, all the necessary equipment for cotton production was in disrepair or virtually non-existent. The loss of enslaved labor, the main driver of cotton production, was an even more significant blow to the South. But again, exploitation and brute force were the basis for this cruel system. Suddenly, the world's most influential community, the white elitists, disappeared, and the cotton economy collapsed. The Old South couldn't survive without African Americans, and white Southerners were angry at the prospect of having to pay for the labor. In the midst of all that was going on, now they had to pay for something that they never had to pay for before. In their minds, why should they pay for it now? Why should they pay for it now? The so-called American dream was impossible in such a terroristic regime because African Americans had limited access to wealth. They had limited access to achievement and growth mechanisms. They were on the bottom. Now, this is what happened. The war between the states, more commonly known as the Civil War, ended on April 9th in 1865. The Southern troops surrendered to the Northern troops. And a year in, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which made this declaration that all persons held as slaves would be free, and there would be no more slavery. Although this was a great day, the Emancipation Proclamation was still not a law. For the Emancipation Act to become law, it would have to be passed in both houses of Congress. Now, get this. Despite Abraham Lincoln's abolishment of slavery, enslaved African Americans remained enslaved. And why is that so important? Listen, imagine that what it would be like to be black in Mississippi on April 10th, 1865, the day after the Civil War ended. What are your thoughts on this? When you tell the old slave master, peace, I'm out, and walk off the plantation where you were once enslaved and brutalized, it must feel nearly like an impossibility. I don't think that was an easy thing to do. One would probably fear that walking off the plantation would only bring more savagery or even being shot in the back before reaching the road. Consequently, I think that most thought that it was safer to hunker down in place and wait for a significant change before they made any significant moves. Now, as well as experiencing anxiety, white enslavers were also experiencing a sense of insecurity. They were suddenly 4 million formerly enslaved people in the South. Despite the South's best efforts to resist the dismantlement of slavery, because of their cruelty, white Southerners must have feared, what are these black folks gonna do to us now? In addition to taking them away from their homeland, they were bound, shackled, and enslaved for generations, treated worse than farm animals. There was the possibility in the mind of the white Southerners that blacks would now rise up and kill them. So what they did was they kept their heads down. They began to plan and hoping and praying that this was just a bad dream. The Emancipation Proclamation had not yet been enacted, was not in effect. And without warning, President Lincoln was assassinated 4 days after he declared slavery's freedom. As a result of his killing, Andrew Johnson became the President of the United States. Now, this was a good old boy. He was from the South, and he began pardoning generals and all kinds of soldiers and eradicating the Emancipation Act mercilessly. For white Southerners, it might just be a horrible dream after all, because they've got someone in power who knows how to pull the switches and do systemically what was impossible for someone to do as a ally to Black Americans. According to Johnson and most Southerners, the intellects of the formerly enslaved people rendered them helpless in managing their own affairs and their own lives. Therefore, he also thought that African Americans should not be entitled to the vote. To bring the South into submission and to protect these newfound rights of African Americans, a group of radical members of Congress intervened and forced the Lincoln Reconstruction to move on as planned, marking the period that we know as the Radical Reconstruction. Now, freedom must have been a hallelujah moment for the enslaved who had never known freedom before. There would be no more scraps from the master's table for enslaved Americans to eat, and as a result, they would be independent. An absolute dream of African Americans was owning their own homes, attending their own places of worships and schools, and having the freedom to move around and move about without restriction. In most cases, they were looking at the potential more than anything else. Freedom should not only be enjoyed and received, but it should also be lived. Nevertheless, Southern whites began planning to return African Americans to slavery immediately after Congress passed the 13th Amendment. As a result of the tyranny of the South, African Americans were severely denied their rights and exploited as slave laborers. It was called the Black Codes, which ultimately meant African Americans would continue to be enslaved. Now, there's a critical point here. It is essential to remember that the Reconstruction had the purpose of establishing an equal and biracial society following the Civil War. In addition to serving on juries, becoming witnesses in trials, and serving as judges, Reconstruction also gave African Americans a voice in the South's history. The legislation also set the stage for generations of Black politicians within the South's government. There were as many as 1,500 that served through the end of the 19th century. Further, Reconstruction helped many Southern states establish free public schools by passing new social legislations. While Reconstruction was in some ways a new war for freedom, it came at a very high price. There was much retaliation and hatred and attack from Southern whites. As white resistance to the biracial government increased, national political support decreased. It became increasingly difficult for African Americans fighting for their freedom to receive federal aid and sympathy from sympathetic Northerners. New laws targeted African Americans, and criminalized their lives in every state and every county. For example, a farm worker could not walk beside a railroad track, nor could he speak loudly in the presence of a white woman in the South. In addition, the sale of the crops from African American farms after dark became illegal. Spitting on the sidewalk, being accused of drunkenness, or loitering in public places could also result in confinement. In 1874, the balance of power in Congress completely changed, and the South returned to its former power. Following the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, the brutal Reconstruction struggle ended. Now, under his orders, the government removed federal troops from the South, and state governments took over the administration. This put fascism in full swing, as many of the laws implemented by Congress that guaranteed equal rights for African Americans were now immediately reversed. As I continue here, I want to stop and explain that this isn't a speech about all the bad things that white men did to African Americans. It isn't a speech about all the injustices that were perpetrated by white systems that support and promote racism. The simple truth is that we know what white men did. Despite his unwillingness to admit this truth, he knows what he did. The opportunity this evening is mine to speak about what we did with the bit of political and social power that we were given. This conversation is more about Black excellence. This conversation surrounds the results of 300 years of enslavement, cruelty, and exploitation. African Americans blessed our country with the blues as a result of such. We introduced gospel music amidst our silent, weary tears, and jazz amidst our subtle yearnings and sullenness. As a result of our royal and radical spirit, hip-hop was born. Now, the above-mentioned matters have undoubtedly left an indelible mark on U.S. history, and they helped shape us as a nation. I'm talking about real Black power, not just a bald raised fist or shouting Black Lives Matter. In this way, Black power is the product that grows from our character, our imagination, and our courage. And it tells a lot about our identity right now and what our roles will be in the future. At this moment, the responsibility of leadership falls on us. The brand of leadership that this moment calls for can only be accomplished by our willingness to learn from our history. It's time to take note from organizations of the 1960s, such as the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, and do not divide the movement into fractions, but grow our arms around the entire planet to fight the infestation of fascism. Our world's darkest corners holds the seeds of systemic racism, bigotry, and hatred. These things must be eradicated and sabotaged. The kind of movement that will positively affect our nation. And the world that we live in won't be found in the schoolhouse. There'll be no evidence of it in the State House. The courthouse will not have it either. And I'm sorry to say, neither will the White House. In any case, this meeting must occur in your house, the house where you live. Conversations that will change social narratives surrounding inclusion, liberty, and justice must begin in the house that you live in. As we close down ignorance of racial inferiority and disdain for those who look different from us, we will eradicate fascism as well. Our world will suffer if we fail to stand shoulder to shoulder and hand in hand. If we fail to do so, we will suffer as a nation and contribute to the destruction of the world that we live in. We can do this, people. When we stir from the bottom, everybody rises. I am glad to have had this conversation with you today. I hope that it's brought some light to your psyche. And I know that in our next conversation, we'll hear more about the journey and the efforts of African Americans moving forward. This is Edie Mondaine, and I'm here as your community voice, helping us move forward in our future. God bless you.